I'm going to be talking about a project I've been working on for a number of years, which culminated in the book, The Grassland Plants of the British and Irish Lowlands. And I'm going to share my screen with you now. Okay, so Grassland Plants of the British and Irish Lowlands. This is the flyer for the book. It was a book co-authored by staff from BSBI, Pete Stroh and Kevin Walker, and staff from the UK conservation agencies, myself and Tim Blackstock from Countryside Council for Wales and Natural Resources Wales, and then Richard Jeffson and Claire Pinches from Natural England. Okay, so when you're talking about grasslands, you're often thinking about grassland decline. We're talking about the semi-natural grasslands, of course, species-rich grasslands, and decline of grasslands is something ecologists working in lowland sites have been concerned about for many years, and this decline has been picked up by the media in recent years. So this is from The Guardian in 2015, and then from The Independent in 2018, and ITV Report in 2018. And this is a clip from an advertisement that's on the television at the moment for Botanica products, and it quotes this now much quoted figure of 97% loss of wildflower meadows, which originally came from this paper by R.M. Fuller in 1986. And it's obviously sort of emphasizes the huge loss of grasslands over recent decades. So what's happened in Wales? So we've got a couple of surveys we compared. These are field-based surveys. This is the first one in the 1930s, reported on by Davis. And then in the 1980s, 90s, we had the phase 1 habitat survey. And you can see huge differences in the two surveys. And the differences are essentially the replacement of semi-natural grasslands with improved grasslands across the Welsh lowlands. And the conclusion being that the declining lowland semi-natural grassland in Wales is more than 90% between the 1930s and the 1980s and 90s. So a slightly better situation than the 97% reported by Fuller, but nevertheless still pretty dire. The current situation in Wales, we now have 78,000 hectares of semi-natural grassland, so it's less than 4% of the whole of Wales. And losses are continuing, so it's not just a late 20th century phenomenon, we're still losing semi-natural grasslands. And grasslands are the most fragmented ecosystem in the Welsh lowlands, so just this map shows a range of different grassland types signified by the different colours, and you can see they're sort of very fragmented with the sort of gaps in between, essentially largely improved grassland. Another variety of other major negative impacts on grasslands, apart from sort of fertilizing and ploughing, we have undermanagement, atmospheric pollution, climate change, and decline in invertebrates. So, by way of a bit of background, the grassland habitat types we're talking about in the study include the unimproved neutral grasslands, or the lowland meadows, calcareous grasslands, marshy grasslands, acid grasslands, and finally a very rare type, calaminarian grasslands, which are those that occur on soils rich in heavy metals. So in terms of the project, it began back in 2007, so it's been a long haul, and we came up at that time we came up with 4 project objectives, which have stayed pretty constant throughout the project. So briefly, they were to first of all compile a list of grassland species and species of conservation concern. Secondly, to develop ecological profiles for each of the sort of threatened species. To undertake some analysis to look at their sort of performance, and to make recommendations for conservation programs. And at that point, a consortium of CH and BSBI came in to start the work off, and CH dropped out later. BSBI became a sort of constant feature of the contracts over the years. So the first thing was to come up with a list of the threatened grassland species. And first of all, we wanted a list of lowland grassland species. What is a lowland grassland species? It's actually quite a difficult question to answer, but we tried to do it in a formal way. We looked at the National Vegetation Classification tables and picked out species that were in grassland communities. We looked at national grassland data sets, including the Lowland Grassland Survey of Wales, which has over 10,000 relevés. We looked at published information on grassland habitats for rare and scarce species, and inevitably we used a bit of expert judgment as well. What we excluded from the project were coastal and upland species, or species predominantly in those habitats, neophytes, apomicts, and hybrids. And we came up with a total of 458 species. So this is essentially the number of vascular plant species that are present in lowland grasslands in Wales, in the UK. So which species were included? Well, something like greater butterfly orchid in Wales, we kind of think of that as a neutral meadow species. But in parts of England, it's actually predominantly a woodland species. So that kind of emphasises how it is sometimes quite difficult to decide whether a species is a grassland species or not. Wood anemone, probably most people say, well, it's a woodland species, but it's actually quite a distinctive plant of certain types of grassland, particularly upland fringe meadows in northern England and certain types of wet grassland. So we actually included that as one of our grassland species, even though it's predominantly obviously in woodlands. So the next stage was to pick out which of these species are threatened by our sort of definition of threatened. So we obviously included species that were on the formal threat lists, such as vulnerable, endangered, and so on. And we also included the near threatened species on those lists. We included red data listed species and nationally scarce species. And we include species that have suffered significant declines in lowland grasslands. This was quite important, we thought, because we wanted to include something like mountain everlasting. Even though if you're a botanist working in northern Scotland, you'd probably think, well, we've got loads of it here in the uplands, but in parts of lowland, most of lowland UK and Ireland, it's extremely rare and threatened species. So ultimately, we came up with a list of 109 threatened grassland species. The vast majority of those are formally listed under the threat lists or are near threatened. So why are some grassland plants more threatened than others is the next question. And this was the analytical work we undertook. What were the sort of characteristics of those plants that made them intrinsically more threatened? So we analysed threat in relation to a range of different plant characteristics. We essentially compared the 109 threatened species against the remainder, the 349 other grassland species, the non-threatened species. And we came up with a number of key attributes that seemed to sort of, be implicated in the reasons species were threatened. And these were small stature, association with infertile soils, transient seed bank, limited or no colonial spread, and a lack of adaptation for dispersal by either water or animals. So just an example of a species which matches these attributes. This is field gentian, Gentianella campestris, and unfortunately for that species, it ticks all the wrong boxes. It's a small species, it occurs on infertile soils, doesn't have a persistent seed bank, it doesn't have any clonal spread, and it has no specialized structures to aid dispersal. So it's perhaps not surprising it's had massive declines over the recent decades. So just looking a bit deeper at these characteristics, why are they significant? Small stature, probably this is related largely to undermanagement, because undermanagement of grassland is a huge issue, as mentioned here by Bullock et al. 2011, which is the NEA, the National Ecosystem Assessment. And if you look at this kind of swords like this, which many grasslands are suffering from this kind of neglect of management, you can imagine that any plant that's of small stature is going to have, going to struggle in that kind of environment. Secondly, soil fertility. This could be caused by fertilizer application, atmospheric nitrogen deposition, or a combination of the two. And many species are unable to compete under the conditions of raised soil fertility. Thirdly, seed banks. Species unable to recolonize following suboptimal management is what we think this is down to. So again, it relates often to undermanagement. Species simply can't sort of grow through the sort of mat of undermanaged vegetation. Could also relate to overgrazing in some situations, but mostly probably undermanagement. Clonal species. This is it seems to sort of probably relate to the fact that clonal species, if they can form sizable patches, it just makes them a bit more resistant to periods of suboptimal management, such as, again, undermanagement. And then dispersal limitations, the fact that species that are dispersed by water or animals are somehow at a slight advantage over, for example, those dispersed by wind. This is something that contradicts to some extent other studies, so I think it's something that requires further investigation. So now just a quick overview of the results for Wales from the study. Of the 109 threatened species, 64 of those occur in Wales, so more than half. 34 species are red listed in Wales, including 10 being critically rare. And 15 of the 109 are listed as priority species under the Environment Act. In addition, the UK has an international responsibility for 8 of the 109 species. 6 of these occur in Wales, the 6 mentioned below, a couple of which I will talk about a bit later. So the third thing we wanted to do was develop a profile for each of the threatened species, and these ecological profiles for the 109 species form the bulk of the book. So in order to do that, we've initially developed a traits database of all the different sort of characteristics that these threatened species have, so their habitats, their ecology, their phenology, and so on. And then we listed and collated a huge range of relevant references to back up. So we wanted to evidence everything, essentially. And then we just got on with writing the accounts, which took many years, because they're each quite sort of, a lot of research needed for each account, and each take quite a bit of writing. But this is essentially what they look like in the book, for those of you who haven't got the book. And these are the sections we have in there. So short sections on identification and similar species, and then longer sections on the species habitats, on biogeography, ecology, threats, and management. And then we also include a distribution map for each species, a photograph of the species, and also we were quite keen to include habitat species, just to relate not the species, to where they occur, and also sort of, to help think about the ecology of the species and their management. So I'm going to take you through a few of the species we looked at. This is the first one. This is Viscioribus wood vitavetch. So I picked out some species that are particularly important for Wales. This is a plant that's mainly in neutral to mildly acid grasslands, especially in hay meadows. It's an endemic plant to Western Europe, and Wales has at least 8 sites with more than 1,000 individuals. So there's some significant populations in Wales. Britain and Ireland holds a significant proportion of the world population, and Wales has 62% of the British population. So that just goes to emphasise the importance of the Welsh examples. This is the distribution map for Britain. You can see it's mostly in mid-Wales. It sort of tends to avoid coastal areas. It seems to like a sort of moist climate. So in trying to sort of delve a bit deeper about this plant, there are a few points on the ecology. It's a long-lived species. I've got some in my garden, which I grew from seed about 25 years ago. It's still going strong, and it seems to be the same plant that comes up year on year. Has good seed production, and the seeds are large, possibly dispersed by small mammals or birds, or possibly in the past in hay bales when hay was moved around the countryside a bit more than it is now. So in terms of the management, low or zero fertilizer applications, grazing not too heavy, and hay meadows are favoured. So I think the thing about this plant is if you manage a site in the right way for it, particularly consider hay meadow management, then it should persist, and it might even expand its population size. But in terms of moving from one site to the next, given the sort of fragmentation we talked about of grassland ecosystems previously, it's going to be very difficult for this plant to move around and colonize new sites. So this is Veronica spicata, spiked speedwell. This is a nationally scarce perennial, mainly of calcareous grassland. It's a post-glacial relic, so it's thought to be a species that was once much more common when areas of sort of very dry, more basic soils were more widespread in Britain, but has declined as kind of woodland and other habitats took over, and is now sort of left remaining in sort of basically refugia sites mostly on limestone rock. Still fairly frequent in parts of Europe. In Central Europe, it's essentially a steppe species. It becomes increasingly rare the further west you go. It's split into two different races, one of which, hybrida, is the population that occurs in Wales, and Wales is particularly important for this this race of Veronica spicata. That's the distribution. It's very sort of scattered, as you can see, typical glacial relic species. So you've got populations in North Wales, and then these sort of scattered populations in Mid Wales, Pembrokeshire, and Gower, with big spaces in between. In terms of its ecology, good seed production, but colonization of distant new sites probably never happens. Reproduction is probably mostly vegetative. And then key management aspects, maintenance of very low fertility is critical, and control of scrub. And that's probably its biggest threat at the moment, is expansion of scrub, especially non-native species like Cotoneaster on the limestone sites in the north. That's a particular worry. So it's a species you probably wouldn't worry about it expanding populations to new sites, but it's all about really managing the sites that you have in the right way, and particularly in this case controlling scrub. So just one final species to have a quick look at. This is Trocdaris verticillator, otherwise known as Carum verticillatum in old language, world caraway. This is a species, a near-threatened perennial, mainly of ross pastures, of damp grassland and associated habitats. It's European endemic, confined to the western fringes of Europe, and the UK has an international responsibility for it, probably having more than 25% of the world population. South West Wales is one of its main strongholds, and that's a world stronghold. But losses have caused fragmentation of population in its core areas. So just looking at the map, it looks pretty secure in its core areas, but there have been sort of local losses. So in some ways, you have to sort of drill down into those kind of 10 kilometre squares to really sort of and look at individual sites, and a lot of sites have been lost over recent years. So a few brief things about ecology. It's long-lived, it propagates by seed, and seed set can be good, but, and this is perhaps a crucial thing, it needs optimum conditions, for seeds to germinate, it needs good light levels and it needs damp conditions, but not waterlogged. The seed bank is non-persistent. In terms of management, cattle, horse grazing is preferable to sheep. This is largely because sheep don't graze the sort of tussocky rushes and moor grass that it often occurs in. Hay meadow management can also be okay. Seeds may not germinate in rank conditions due to insufficient light. So again, this is a species where you're thinking about the management. If you can, manage a site well for this species with cattle and horse grazing, then it should be able to persist. And then there's decisions to be made about, what we do about sites that have been lost, whether we think about trying to restore some of those. So the final thing that we wanted to think about with this project were recommendations for conservation. So we came up with a series of 5 recommendations. First of all, to focus conservation measures at sites of threatened species, particularly those with large populations and or multiple species present, such as this photo below, which is a Great Orm's Head. It's a slope that has things like spotted cat's ear, Goldilocks aster, and spike speedwell on it. Ensure that appropriate grazing and cutting regimes are maintained or reinstated. So that could be dealing with sites that have been overgrazed or, undergrazed sites, as I mentioned before. Thirdly, prevent harmful increases in soil fertility and acidification. It sounds fairly obvious, but there are obviously issues with atmospheric nitrogen deposition, where it comes sometimes from intensive agriculture like dairy or poultry units, and also just sort of from cars, car exhausts, power stations, pollution, which essentially release nitrogen into the air, which then falls and causes soil fertility. So 2 final things: undertake habitat expansion measures. So this is fairly obvious thing in many ways, but often it will be about getting it in the right place. So for something like World Caraway, some habitat expansion measures to try and increase the grassland area on sites next door to existing populations would be really useful. And finally, and most contentious, consider the potential for the introduction of threatened species to unoccupied sites. Do we actually go out there and start introducing seed of these threatened species to new sites that we've restored? So just finally, what next? Well, first of all, there's some really good work going on in Wales already. We have various meadow groups, such as Monmouthshire Meadow Groups. We have Pont doing some great work on grazing of sites. And we have this new project, Natur am Byth, which is getting going now. It's several £1 million to help tackle issues for threatened species. But there obviously are problems. Hundreds of species in Wales are under threat. This is BBC report 2019. More recent BBC report showed that almost half of Wales's protected sites are not monitored, and many of those are undermanaged at the present time, or just managed badly. So there's lots of issues, and it is perhaps hoped that there's things will change in the farming systems, and particularly with new agri-environment schemes coming online. It's hoped that some of these issues can be dealt with at a national level, because although we have these local projects doing fantastic work, it's really action at a national level we now need. Okay, that's me. Thank you for listening. That's goodbye for me.